and I'm very happy to be here. I apologize, I was a couple minutes late. I'm in Madurai. I was running from some events, but I'm not sure how I will physically launch this, but I see up in front of me the screen. There you go. Thank you for whoever's operating the controls. Great. I have with me a copy of the report, which I perused. It is a very interesting document, has a lot of granular detail. I commend the people who have put it together. I encourage everyone to read it. I think it's enlightening and maybe in some ways thought-provoking about what is going well and what could be improved, and where we can kind of step up a little bit. So first, my congratulations to Satwa for creating this report and for persistently requesting my attendance at this event, which I think not for requesting me, but for insisting that the event happen. And I'm happy to be here. Let me start perhaps with my concerns about the whole notion of corporate social responsibility. As was mentioned in the introduction, I went to business school in the US. What is perhaps not mentioned is that I went very late in life. I went after the age of 32 or 33, something like that, by which time I'd already run a successful consulting practice, even as an immigrant in the US, and I had understood the world a bit. And I remember distinctly in one of my business ethics courses, writing an essay, should social responsibility be part of a corporation's kind of core agenda? And I had argued quite lucidly, I thought, but certainly quite boldly, that it should not. I said, the shareholders, and I was talking about a particular context in the US, and I said, the shareholders elect the agents who run it, the board of directors and their appointees as the management, to deliver the results that they bought the share for. They didn't appoint them to be guardians of society. They didn't appoint them to be, purveyors of what is good and fair in the world and what should take priority over what. And so, of course, the context changes, and the law of the land is the law of the land. But the primary concern when it comes to things like corporate social responsibility is, though the guidelines exist and though the government gives a bit of a framework, that it requires some very conscientious thinking and some very humble kind of data gathering and seeking, rather than use this as a vehicle to advance any personal agenda. And that I say without ever coming to today's meeting, because this is a view I've held now for 20 years plus. But to keep consistency in my views, I'll make the example that in the Assembly in the recent budget debate, many of the MLAs asked that the constituency development funds, which you can see as somewhat parallel to the corporate social responsibility funds, in the sense that each member gets to decide how to spend that within some guidelines in their constituency, to focus on grassroots, granular problems that maybe policymakers for the state level cannot. We administer a 3,30,000 or so crore budget. The MLA development fund is 3 crores. So there was a universal request that people should be given unlimited flexibility in how those funds should be used. And I took it up to the chief minister and I said, I've been an opposition MLA for 5 years. I feel like I've done a good job. I certainly had the record of the number of projects done, therefore the granularity of this project, and therefore the likelihood that the fund was used for the right reason and not for margin seeking and stuff like that. And in 5 years, I did 150 projects, from Anganwadis to ration shops to drinking water to scan machines at PHCs to whatever it was. So maybe it's not a bad idea. And then a whole lot of chief secretary, IAS officers gave counter examples of how easily these funds can be mismanaged or misused, and why the state needed to have some guidelines. And in fact, there was not that much support for the notion of relaxing the guidelines and letting it go free, right now it's tied and says this percentage must be spent on buildings, this percentage on children, this percentage on water, whatever it is. So that's the big dichotomy or the kind of tension, if you will, in things like corporate social responsibility. Of course, it is good for society. It is good for the human condition if people who are otherwise in the business of profit are also applying their minds and their resources to the benefit of individuals and the progress of society. Question is how and under what kind of framework and what ethical constraints. So I've read the executive summary and the kind of details of the report. And let me just point out, just out of these, some things that strike me right away. This is a huge amount of money. 92,605 crores in just 6 years since the inception of this kind of statutory or mandatory, legally mandated CSR activity. That's a lot of money. As I say, that's more probably than 3 times or roughly 3 times what the government of Tamil Nadu spends in kind of urban development and water management in the last year, of which 38%, which I'm sad to say, has been tagged as pan-India. There are very few things that you can do successfully pan-India. Even the government of India fails to do pan-India successfully on things like Swachh Bharat. We've all heard of the inability to get the funds used in time, or the inability to ensure that water continues to be supplied to the toilets that were built under these funds, because those are municipal administration activities, cannot be administered on an ongoing basis indefinitely from the government of India. So I would see that as a bit of a negative, that 38% of the funding has gone on pan-India initiatives. I understand that the second highest allocation is to the state of Maharashtra, which is probably 12 to 15% of the GDP of the country. I'm a bit concerned again that Tamil Nadu is only the 4th highest recipient in India, because it is certainly the second highest total GDP state in terms of scale of population. Included per capita, it is not second, it's third or fourth, but total GDP because of the size of the state. 42% have been directed by implementing agencies, some of which I assume, or many of which I assume, in the non-profit sector. Again, that can be a good or bad thing. The report points out that women's empowerment and the conservation of natural resources or environmental sustainability have seen a declining trend in spending. Again, that is a bit concerning. I'm a bit heartened by the fact that 67% of the spending in Tamil Nadu has been towards education, healthcare, and rural development, compared to an average of only 59% for India. I would hope that more of that goes towards rural development. I'm also concerned that 3 or 4 big corporates account for 16% of the total CSR spending, and that 72% of all CSR spending in Tamil Nadu comes from companies that are headquartered in the state. As a big state, we have many different companies headquartered elsewhere that have significant portions of their operations or their offices or their activities in Tamil Nadu. And last, in terms of quantitative concerns, the Chief Minister has said very clearly in his address to the Economic Advisory Council that we put together, the Global Economic Advisory Council, and it is integral to our notion of social justice and inclusive growth, that we would not like to see any left behind districts or left behind areas, just like we don't like to see left behind communities. So the report points out that the bulk of CSR activity happens in Chennai and Coimbatore, and the 2 aspirational districts are only getting about 1%. So I hope these are all kind of a wake-up call and a motivator or incentive for the big corporates and those who are spending this money and allocating this money to be more thoughtful and more granular and detailed in their approach and in their activities going forward. Let me just say a couple more things and then I'll stop. One is that the nature of government is not kind of conducive in many ways to the aspirations of the people. I was at an event yesterday where one of our economic advisors, Dr. S. Narayan, made the point that for over 100 years, or a couple 100 years in the British time, but certainly even going back to our culture, the nature of government administration has been mostly towards the collection of revenue, either land-based revenue or transaction-based revenue, and that we are not actually well designed in terms of governmental setup for an agenda of development or inclusive growth or job creation. That's certainly true. The immediate way you can find that is to look at the nature of our titles. You know, the person who is the number one government official in our district is called collector. Collector of what? Because at one point he was a collector of taxes, he was a collector of revenue. And that was the most important function for the government in the colonial days when the British ran the government. And so it was their job to look at kind of ensuring the empire got its fair share. So in that sense, we are not set up ideally, and ever since coming to office, that has become painfully clear to me that we need some profound reforms. And you know, as the Chief Minister again stated in his address to the Council of Economic Advisors, that he is well aware of this, and he stands ready for not just transformation, but for radical reform. What that does, though, is provide an opportunity for people who have the kinds of skills that government ought to have, but doesn't, which is the corporates. The people who have the kind of data-driven, performance-oriented, benchmarkable, accountable, documentable processes that a government ought to have, or at least a government with a development agenda ought to have, but doesn't quite. You have all of those. The corporate world has all of those. As somebody who operated in the corporate world for a few decades, I can certainly validate that. And so the real value that I think this initiative overall can add to society is for the corporate world to help shape the debate and shape the kind of progress by applying the skills that they have, which government doesn't but ought to have, in the course of doing the CSR activity that you do. So, for example, to be much more granular, to be much more data-driven, to be much more outcome-focused, to be much more performance evaluative, and to hold accountability and set up checks and balances and kind of validation methodologies to ensure that the funds that people donate or that the corporations contribute reach the last mile and deliver to the end user. In fact, I'll go one step further. The problem with government is that the lack of the proper administrative procedures, the lack of the proper infrastructure, data, continuity, institutional memory, institutional knowledge, is that the big problems get recognized, but maybe cannot get resolved. And the little problems just fall through the cracks. They don't come up to the level of being noticed, certainly by those who are politically elected to deal with such outcomes or to deal with such problems. And there, I think the corporate CSR efforts can actually play a big role, because you certainly have the capacity to work on the kind of point, granular, your area, your system, your branch office surrounding issues that may not bubble up to the level of interest of a big government department or a ministry. And I'll go one step further and say that many times you can be the leading example for us, right? When we look around Tamil Nadu, we see much of the water conservation efforts and the kind of redevelopment of ponds and areas and kulams and kammais has been done by NGOs, supported in many cases by CSR funds and personal donations. And they serve as a benchmark, also as a kind of leveling mechanism to say, can the government live up to this standard, or can the government adopt these standards as our way of operating going forward? So in that sense, contrary to my views of this on this subject, let's say 20 years ago, I'm now of the opinion that in the course of the progress of society and the resolution of problems, there is a crucial role to be played by the corporate entities that have the expertise, the requisite infrastructure, the skill set and the people that is sometimes lacking in government, in many cases glaringly lacking in government. And not only will you be of great benefit to society, but you can prove the gold standard to which the government must be held accountable and can improve itself. I'll just end with one comment, which is that many of the NGOs that I think add the greatest value to democracy and society are the ones that hold government accountable, the ones that shed transparency on the functioning of the government, that point out the weaknesses or glaring omissions or the anti-democratic or the anti-integrity activities that any government, I'm not talking about any particular party or any particular state, but all governments, the balance of power in a democracy requires strong, independent institutions. Some of those institutions will be within the framework of the Constitution, like the judicial system, or independent bodies, or ideally independent bodies like the Election Commission or the Accountant General. But some of those surely must come from civil society and be the press, be activist NGOs and so forth. So I think the support of those through corporate social responsibility also is an important way that corporates can add value to the improvement of the nature of our democracy, the fabric of our society, and the lives of people. With that, let me conclude my remarks. I'm not sure if there's time for questions. I also have to leave actually in a few minutes for another series of events, but I'm happy to stay on for a couple of minutes if somebody wants to say or ask something. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tyagarajan. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Tyagarajan. My name is Meera Harish. I'm a partner at Sattva Consulting. We haven't provided for a Q&A, but I do want to thank you. And I want to take a couple of minutes doing that because the three things that we had on the agenda today in terms of just an outcome from today's TN CSR Summit are exactly the three things that you spoke about, sir. And it was just so inspiring, right, to just hear you say that. One is really have the one big lacuna that the CSR ecosystem has had for several years in this country really is, not having data-backed insights, right? You don't look at it with the lens of data. And at Sattva, that's something that we've kind of tried to do, which is why I think for all of us colleagues, as you were speaking, we were just delighted on WhatsApp in joy that you've read the report and you really called out some of the highlights because what we are enabling both in India and Tamil Nadu with corporates that we work with is, can we have data-backed insights lead decision making in CSR, right? Which is, so we've enabled that rather successfully with a lot of corporates. And as I segue from data-backed insights to the next thing which we see that's been happening, and something that we want to kind of work on is move CSR a little more strategically rather than look at it tactically, project to project, program to program, year to year, and with a compliance lens. Can we just look at CSR strategically, which then will make us move the needle on the development agenda for the state? So that's one of the key outcomes we want as an outcome of today's summit as well. Look at it strategically so that you really move the needle long term. And go deep in solving problems. And the third, Dr. Tyagarajan, is the importance of partnerships. You mentioned government. We have Dhwani Foundation, who's partnered us today, bringing in a lot of grassroots NGOs who are in the audience today, just very inspired, and we're waiting to hear you speak with your work that you've done as well over the years. So what we wanted to enable today is, we've got the finest set of corporates from Tamil Nadu, as well as corporates from rest of India who are working on Tamil Nadu. For example, the National Stock Exchange works on the 2 aspirational districts in Tamil Nadu. So we've got a pan-India corporate spending on Tamil Nadu, and Tamil Nadu corporates, some of the finest. We've got a whole host of grassroots NGOs, some of them speaking on the panels today. We've got academia, because there is a fair bit of money across the country that's going into incubators and accelerators with the IITs and the IIMs of this country, and they are solving for social impact. right? And a fair bit of CSR money is going, and we wanted to encourage a lot more of it from Tamil Nadu as well, going into that. So we have a professor from IIT Madras as well. And then we have, of course, government representation on some of the panels. So this is how we curated the day today. And just hearing you after the first panel was just fantastic. So thank you very much on behalf of Sattva, on behalf of Dhwani and the Madras Management Association. And thanks very much. This was very, very inspiring, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thanks very much.